Good evening, and welcome back to History Sales. It is the night of the 16th to 17th of December, 1793, on a muddy hillside above the port of Toulon, in the south of France. The rain has been falling for days, turning every path into a river of cold mud. A young artillery officer, not yet 24 years old, short, thin, with dark hair falling loose around a sallow, sharp-boned face, is riding along the ridge in the dark, checking his gun positions one final time before dawn. His name means little to anyone outside this valley tonight. In a few hours, that will begin to change. Somewhere below him, behind earthworks and palisades, sit the guns of Fort Mulgrave, the position the British call, almost affectionately, the Little Gibraltar. He has spent weeks convincing generals twice his age that everything, the whole siege, the fate of the port, depends on taking that one hill. Tonight, he intends to prove it. Before this attack ends, a bayonet will open a wound in his thigh that he will carry quietly for the rest of his life. But by the time the sun rises fully over the bay, the British and Spanish fleets crowding the harbor below will already be making the decision to leave France for good. This is the story of how that young officer's first real battle began, and tonight, that is where we start. Take a moment to like this video if these slow histories help you fall asleep, and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And if you feel like it, drop your location and your local time in the comments. There's something quietly nice about knowing someone else, somewhere else in the world, is settling in to hear the same story tonight. Now settle in, loosen your shoulders, let the day go, and let's begin. By the summer of that same year, the French Revolution had reached its most dangerous hour. The king, Louis XVI, gentle and hopelessly indecisive, had already lost his head to the guillotine, and in response, most of the crown powers of Europe had banded together against the young republic. Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, Spain, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and the Kingdom of Naples had all joined what history would remember as the First Coalition. From the northwest, British and Dutch forces pressed toward Dunkirk. From the east, Austrian and Prussian armies crossed the border and seized the city of Mainz. From the south, Spanish troops pushed over the Pyrenees, and Sardinian forces came down from the Alps toward Grenoble. France, barely 4 years into its revolution, found itself surrounded on every side. Much of this was Britain's doing, a patient, methodical campaign of treaties and gold. Through the spring and summer of that year, British diplomats signed one alliance after another, with Hanover in March, with Russia later that same month, with the Hessian Count in April, with Sardinia later in April, with Spain in May, with Naples in July, with Prussia also in July, with the Holy Roman Empire in August, and with Portugal in September. Each treaty came bundled with money and muskets, all of it aimed at strangling the infant republic before it could grow any stronger. But France's troubles were not only foreign. The nation's own instability had done half of Britain's work already. Paper money had lost nearly 2/5 of its value within a single year. A working man's daily wage, which had once bought 2 pounds of bread, now bought barely 1. Royalist sympathizers, quietly funded by British gold, stirred rebellion in city after city. By the summer, 60 of France's 83 provinces were in open revolt. In Lyon, the fleur-de-lis of the old monarchy flew once more over the city gates. In the Vendée region, royalist farmers turned into a stubborn guerrilla army that bled the Republic's forces white. And then came Toulon, Toulon sat on the Mediterranean coast, the great naval fortress of southern France, home port to much of the Republic's Mediterranean fleet. In July, local officials there quietly turned against the revolutionary government. By August, believing they could never hold the city against Republican troops, they made a fateful choice. They handed over the fleet, the harbor, the arsenal, and the city itself to the enemy in exchange for protection. On the 28th of August, British Admiral Samuel Hood and Spanish Admiral Juan de Langara sailed their combined fleets into Toulon's harbor and took the city without firing a shot. British troops regulars from 3 infantry regiments, along with sailors pulled straight from their ships, came ashore alongside a much larger Spanish contingent. The loss was catastrophic. 32 French ships of the line and 27 frigates, along with an arsenal stocked with powder, shot, and naval stores beyond counting, had simply been handed to the enemy. Through Toulon, the coalition now had a clean road straight into the heart of southern France, a road that could link up with Sardinian forces pressing down from the Alps and threatened to swallow the entire Provence region whole. Reinforcements poured steadily into the city. By the end of October, the garrison numbered well over 17,000 men, British, Spanish, Neapolitan, Sardinian, and French royalist troops together, with more promised from Austria. In London, the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, was already imagining which French colonies might be demanded as payment once the war was won. The men now holding power in Paris, the Jacobins, harder and more determined than the moderates they had replaced, answered with an iron hand. In August, before Toulon had even fully fallen, they issued the Levée en masse, a total mobilization, calling every able-bodied citizen to the defense of the Republic. Within weeks, some 420,000 new soldiers marched out to the frontiers, singing as they went, moving toward the guns at something close to a run because, as one witness of the age wrote, these were men no longer fighting for a king or for the privilege of noblemen, but for an ideal liberty, equality, and they wanted to reach the fighting before anyone else could claim the honor of dying for it first. It was, in its own raw and undisciplined way, the birth of an entirely new kind of army. And yet, raw courage alone kept losing to smaller, better-trained professional armies again and again, and the young republic knew it needed something more than numbers. It needed a man who could turn all that courage into victory. By late August, once word reached them that the British and Spanish had entered Toulon, Republican forces began closing in around the city. One division of 8,000 men under General Carteau to the west, another of 6,000 under General Lapoipe to the east. Piece by piece, through a string of small skirmishes, the 2 divisions drew their ring tighter around the port, sealing off every road leading out by land. But early in that siege, the Republican army suffered a loss that would prove far more damaging than it first appeared. Its artillery commander, a capable officer named Dommartin, took a musket ball to the shoulder in one of the opening skirmishes and was carried from the field, permanently unfit for further duty in this campaign. It might not have sounded like much, set against the scale of everything else unfolding around Toulon that autumn. In truth, it left a hole that almost nothing else could fill. Taking a fortress as heavily armed as this one, ringed with modern earthworks and covered by naval guns, was above all else a problem of artillery, and at that exact moment, the army besieging it had no one qualified to solve it. A little further inland that same September, a young captain was passing through the region entirely by chance, traveling toward his own artillery regiment and hoping, along the way, to secure a junior officer's commission for his younger brother. He had a Corsican name that meant, in the old Italian of his ancestors, something close to wandering lion, a title the family had traditionally given its second-born sons for generations, though this particular second son had already buried an uncle who died fighting, and a father who had chosen loyalty to France over exile with his old Corsican patron, which is why the son standing at Toulon that autumn was, whatever his blood, entirely and legally a citizen of the French Republic. He was 24 years old, poor, awkward in polite company, formidably well-read in mathematics, and as it happened, the exact kind of officer the siege desperately needed. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and this was not, in fact, his first campaign. Only months before, he had taken part in a badly bungled naval expedition against Sardinia, watching his own small artillery train abandoned on a beach after the men under an older, timid colonel mutinied and forced a retreat before a shot was properly fired. It had taught him, early and painfully, that even a gifted officer's first battle could end in failure through no fault of his own. A lesson that would make the coming months at Toulon feel to him less like an opportunity and more like a debt he intended to collect. A local political official, delighted to find a trained artillery officer passing directly through his siege lines, sent him at once to the acting commander, General Carteau. What Bonaparte found there was almost comic in its mismatch. Carteau was a former portrait painter, a man who had traded his brushes for a uniform when the revolution began, whose most famous canvas, in an irony not lost on anyone who knew the story, had been a formal equestrian portrait of King Louis XVI himself. Dressed in a general's coat trimmed with gold braid, Carteau received the young captain with the easy condescension of a man who assumed the war was already half won. He announced, without much interest in a reply, that he had matters fully under control and needed no assistance, though the newcomer was of course welcome to share in the coming glory if he wished. The state of the siege artillery, once Bonaparte actually inspected it, made that confidence look almost cruel. What passed for the army's heavy guns amounted to a handful of light field pieces entirely unsuited to breaching fortress walls or damaging warships, along with only 6 heavy siege guns recently unearthed from a Marseille arsenal. It was, by any honest measure, nowhere near enough to take a fortified port defended by naval artillery. And before Bonaparte could even begin correcting the problem, Carteau ordered him to open fire on a British squadron from a battery positioned so far from the coastline that the guns were being asked to strike targets roughly 2.5 times beyond their maximum effective range and order. So hopeless that the young grenadiers assigned to heat the cannonballs red hot in nearby farmhouse ovens, the standard method for setting wooden warships ablaze, were dutifully preparing ammunition that could never possibly reach its target. Bonaparte gently but firmly redirected the men. "Leave the fortress taking to the guns," he told them, "and let the infantry support when the moment came," and then set to work almost without sleep, scouring nearby arsenals and depots for every serviceable heavy gun he could find, until within days he had assembled the army's first real siege train. 14 large caliber guns and 4 heavy mortars, along with the ammunition to feed them. For that alone, he was promoted to major within weeks of arriving. It was during these opening weeks that Bonaparte first walked the high ground overlooking the harbor and noticed what almost no one else on the Republican side had yet grasped: a modest headland called Cape La Guillette, still unoccupied by either army, which overlooked both the inner and outer anchorages where the British and Spanish fleets lay at anchor. "Seize that headland with as little as 2,000 men," he argued, and Republican guns placed there could make the entire harbor untenable for the enemy fleet, within a week cut the port off from the sea. And Toulon itself, starved of retreat and resupply, would have little choice but to fall on its own. Carteau, unwilling to be seen dismissing the young officer outright, but equally unwilling to commit real resources to the plan, sent a token force of only 400 men to hold the position far too few. As it turned out, since within days a much larger coalition force landed there instead, stripped the headland of every tree for a clear field of fire, and began building a formidable earthwork the British themselves would come to call Fort Mulgrave, though the men defending it preferred the nickname Little Gibraltar. Carteau's mistrust of his young artillery officer only deepened from there, punctuated by a string of almost farcical interventions. Once, the general proudly pointed out a hilltop position from which, he claimed, Republican guns could bombard 3 separate enemy forts simultaneously, apparently untroubled by the fact that the same hilltop would, by the same logic, sit in clear view of all 3 forts' own guns at once. Another time, Carteau insisted a battery be built directly in front of a row of stone houses, imagining the walls would shield the gun crews, only for Bonaparte to explain, patiently and not for the last time, that stone shattered by artillery fire becomes its own deadly shrapnel, and that proper field fortifications were built from packed earth and timber for exactly that reason. Bonaparte tolerated these interferences as long as he reasonably could. What finally broke his patience came on the 25th of October, after his newly built batteries named, in the plain revolutionary style of the age, Battery Gora and Battery Santa Claire, began scoring real results against the anchored fleet, sinking small vessels and forcing damaged warships back to dry dock for repair. Carteau chose that exact moment, while Bonaparte was away at Marseille scavenging for more supplies, to order both batteries abandoned entirely, claiming their crews had suffered too many casualties to continue. Only Bonaparte's hurried return in time to countermand the order kept the Republic from handing back, through sheer administrative folly, ground that 4,000 coalition soldiers had failed to retake by force. It was around one particularly exposed gun position, sited so close to the enemy lines that a witness would later describe it as sitting well within pistol range of the fort above it, that Bonaparte performed one of his quieter pieces of leadership. The position's original crew had been killed almost to the last man on their very first day manning the guns, and even hardened revolutionary soldiers began to flinch from serving there. Rather than force replacements into the position, Bonaparte simply renamed it the Battery of the Fearless. From that day forward, soldiers competed for the honor of manning it, and the position never again stood short of volunteers. The final push toward Toulon's fall would take another 2 months of grinding effort, new commanders arriving, one after another, each less competent than the man he replaced, and each, in turn, nearly undoing the young major's careful preparations through simple carelessness. One commander, a former dentist with no real command experience, panicked during a spontaneous, unauthorized assault by his own furious troops in mid-November, sounding a retreat at the very moment French soldiers were fighting their way into Fort Mulgrave's rear entrance, undone by nothing more than a stray cannonball that killed an aide standing at his side. Bonaparte, a fresh wound bleeding across his forehead and his temper entirely gone, stormed back to the command post and shouted at the man in language no junior officer should ever have used toward a general, and was, by sheer luck, or perhaps quiet guilt, never disciplined for it. Days later, under pressure from his own furious troops, that commander was quietly reassigned elsewhere. His replacement, an old and genuinely capable soldier named Dugomir, understood immediately what he had in this strange young artillery officer, and it was Dugomir who would recommend Bonaparte's name to Paris. Yet even under Dugomir's steadier hand, one more disaster nearly unraveled everything. Late in November, a group of visiting political representatives, touring a carefully camouflaged new battery that Bonaparte had spent weeks concealing behind olive branches, impulsively ordered it to open fire, simply to see it in action, revealing its position to the enemy at a stroke. The following dawn, a British general led 7,000 men in a furious assault that overran the exposed position entirely and pushed deep enough to threaten the army's own supply depot. It was in the chaos of the counterattack that followed Bonaparte rushing field guns forward to cover the response that fate handed the Republic an almost comic gift. Spotting enemy troops filing into a narrow, concealed lane he himself had built for moving ammunition, Bonaparte slipped his own men into the gap between two separate coalition units and had them fire first to their right, then to their left, convincing each unit it was under attack from the other. In the confusion, the British commanding general himself rode forward to stop what he assumed was friendly fire between his own troops and was captured almost by accident, forced to surrender his sword to the young Frenchman he had spent weeks refusing to take seriously. By the second week of December, the Republic had gathered some 38,000 men around a garrison that, worn down by months of fighting, had shrunk to a little over 16,000. For 2 days and nights before the final assault, French guns under Bonaparte's direction poured somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 rounds into Fort Mulgrave's walls. Then, on the night of the 16th, under driving rain, lightning, and a wind that tore at every lantern and torch along the line, 6,000 French soldiers went forward into the dark toward the fort's walls. Whole companies lost their bearings in the storm and the confusion, falling by the row under grape shot and musket volleys they could barely see coming. After several assaults were thrown back, and the attack itself seemed on the verge of collapse, Bonaparte led the reserve forward personally, and by most accounts called out to the men around him words that would echo, in one form or another, through every account of that night since, that any man who followed him forward would be rewarded, and any man who wavered would answer to him directly. His horse was shot from beneath him in the crush of the advance, and a bayonet opened a wound in his leg that he would carry quietly for the rest of his life. Still, he pressed forward with the men, through hand-to-hand fighting inside the fort itself, until the defenders holding the guns were cut down at their own cannon and Fort Mulgrave. The position everyone had once called impossible to take finally belonged to the Republic. Coalition forces, seeing the position lost and their whole harbor now within range of Republican guns, began preparing to abandon Toulon, entirely setting fire as they withdrew to the arsenal and to the French warships they could not carry away with them. Bonaparte, leading a mixed party of gunners and laborers into the burning port itself 2 nights later, managed to extinguish much of the blaze before it could spread, saving both the arsenal and a substantial part of the fleet, and freeing captured French sailors who had been left chained below decks in the chaos of the retreat. By the morning of the 19th of December, Toulon was fully back in Republican hands, and news of its fall swept across France within days. Few could quite believe that a fortress once thought unbreakable had fallen to a young, unknown captain barely 2 years into any real command experience. Within a month, Bonaparte was formally promoted to Brigadier General, 24 years old, his leg still healing beneath his uniform, his name now known all the way back in Paris. He did not know it yet, standing exhausted and freshly promoted amid the smoke still rising over the harbor. But somewhere Out past the horizon, in the flat green country of northern Italy, an army was waiting. An army that, in a little over 2 years, would be entirely his to command, and through which the rest of his extraordinary life would begin to unfold. 2 years pass, almost to the season. It is the spring of 1796, and the young brigadier from Toulon has been given something far larger than a headland to defend. An entire army, ragged and half-starved, camped along the coast between France and the mountain passes leading down into Italy. He is 27 now, still thin, still restless, newly married only days before leaving Paris, and for the first time in his life, he commands alone. Below him, across the Alps and the Apennines, wait the combined forces of Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia, guarding the rich plains of Piedmont and Lombardy. Tonight, we follow him down out of the mountains and into the campaign that will make his name known across every court in Europe. The appointment itself had come only after months of quiet persistence. For over a year, in whatever post he held, Bonaparte had kept refining a single argument, that France's real path to victory over Austria did not run through the heavily fortified Rhine frontier, where 2 large Republican armies were already grinding forward at enormous cost, but south, through Piedmont and Lombardy, striking at Austria's Italian possessions, and then wheeling north toward Vienna from a direction the Austrians would never expect. He had studied the old campaigns of past French marshals in this same country, walked the mountain passes himself during an earlier posting with the army's artillery, and concluded that one narrow, unglamorous route, a low saddle in the mountains, called the Cadibona Pass, barely worth noticing on most maps, offered a path modest enough in elevation for a proper army, guns and all, to cross even outside the brief summer thaw. When the general originally offered this southern command, balked at executing a plan he considered impossible, the Directory in Paris made an almost mischievous decision. If the young officer who had drawn up the plan believed in it so completely, then he could go carry it out himself. On the 2nd of March, Bonaparte was named commander of the Army of Italy. A week later, he married Josephine. Within days, he had said his goodbyes and was riding south toward Nice, having never in his life personally commanded more than a single battalion of infantry in the field, about to take charge of tens of thousands of men. What he found on arrival was worse than even his own low expectations. On paper, the Army of Italy carried over 100,000 names on its rolls. In reality, prisoners, deaths, and desertions had already stripped away some 36,000 of them. Another 20,000 sat scattered along the coast on garrison duty, answerable only to the government in Paris, and of the remaining 50,000 nominally in the field, 5,000 lay sick in hospital. Once every garrison post and mountain outpost had drawn its share, fewer than 38,000 men remained available to actually fight, supported by barely 20 working field guns. Rations were months in arrears. Many soldiers had no proper boots, no complete uniform, sometimes not even a working musket. On the very night before Bonaparte's arrival, an entire battalion had mutinied outright, refusing to march to a new posting simply because they had no boots to march in. He did not flinch from any of it. "We cannot go on living like this," he told his staff bluntly. "Either we retreat or we advance." Where others might have seen only a broken, beggarly rabble, Bonaparte insisted he could see something else beneath the rags. An army that had, against every disadvantage imaginable, held this stretch of the Alpine frontier for years against a numerically superior enemy, and had even managed, the year before, to win a battle and push its own lines forward, despite everything working against it. Hardship and want, he would later say, make the best school for soldiers, restore their discipline, meet their most basic needs, and these same men, tempered by years of adversity, could still be led to greatness. That would prove easier said than done, not least because his own division commanders had no particular interest in being led by him. 4 senior generals in the army, Massena, Augereau, La Harpe, and Serrurier, each already a celebrated fighter with years of seniority, made little effort to hide their contempt for a 27-year-old newcomer promoted, as far as they were concerned, mostly through political connections in Paris. One story from those first days, retold for generations afterward by Bonaparte's own aide, captures the standoff perfectly. The 4 generals strode into their first meeting with their new commander shoulder to shoulder, open scorn on every face, and gathered around him without so much as removing their hats in courtesy. Bonaparte, standing thin and unremarkable by comparison near the fireplace, removed his own hat first in greeting. Reflexively, out of old habit, all 4 generals removed theirs in return. Bonaparte immediately put his back on and simply stared back at them in silence. Caught off guard, none of the 4 thought to replace their own hats. From that single wordless exchange, so the story goes, every man in that room understood exactly what kind of commander had just arrived among them. Whatever the truth of that particular tale, Bonaparte's actual authority was built on more than a clever trick with a hat. He disbanded the mutinous battalion outright and punished its ringleaders without hesitation. He borrowed money from a local banker and cleared a portion of the army's overdue wages. He doubled the meat ration, reorganized the supply depots, and got transport columns moving again along roads that had sat empty for months. And then, standing before his assembled troops, he delivered a speech that would be repeated and half mythologized for the rest of the century. Soldiers, he told them, you are poorly fed and poorly clothed, and the government owes you a great deal it cannot repay. Yet your courage among these barren cliffs has won you nothing worth the name. Its glory has never reached you. I intend to lead you now into the richest plains on earth, wealthy provinces, splendid cities, all of it waiting for you to take it. Soldiers of the army of Italy, do you have the courage and endurance this march will demand? The answer, from an army that had heard almost nothing but bad news for years, was immediate and total. Facing this newly steadied but still badly outnumbered force stood 2 seasoned enemy commanders who saw absolutely no reason to worry. Piedmont itself, guarded on 3 sides by the Alps, and known to its own people as the Key of the Alps, bristled with fortresses at every mountain gateway. Susa, Cuneo, Seva, Alessandria, Turin built and stocked precisely to make this frontier impassable. The Sardinian army, 25,000 strong and skilled in mountain fighting, held the western approaches under General Colli. The much larger Austrian army, 45,000 men and 140 guns under the veteran field marshal Beaulieu, held the eastern approaches, screening the road to Milan. Between them, a smaller Austrian detachment under General d'Argenteau linked the 2 armies together near the town of Millesimo. Beaulieu, 71 years old and a veteran of wars going back decades, considered his young opponent little more than a jumped-up political appointee, an artillery officer who had never personally commanded more than a single battalion in the field, now somehow expected to manage tens of thousands of men across some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. Neither Beaulieu nor Colli believed there was any realistic way this young general could win. What neither man understood was that the entire logic of 18th century warfare, the logic both of them had spent their careers mastering, was about to become obsolete in front of their own eyes. For most of the century, European armies had avoided decisive battle, almost as a matter of principle. Armies were expensive, difficult to replace, and the accepted wisdom held that a skilled general won wars by starving an enemy's supply lines and besieging his fortresses, not by risking his own hard-trained soldiers in open slaughter. Beaulieu's plan for early April, dividing his forces to advance on 3 separate roads at once, made perfect sense by those old rules. It made him catastrophically vulnerable to a general who no longer played by them. Bonaparte struck the moment he saw the opening. On the 12th of April, near a hill town called Montenot, French divisions under Massena, La Harpe, and Augereau converged from 3 directions at once on D'Argenteau's isolated Austrian column, encircling it almost completely before the fog had even cleared from the valley floor that morning. In a matter of hours, the Austrian detachment lost several thousand men, nearly 2,000 of them taken prisoner, along with 4 captured banners and a dozen guns. It was a modest battle by the standards of what would follow in later years, but its consequences were immediate and enormous. Bonaparte had driven a wedge directly into the seam between the Austrian and Sardinian armies, and neither Beaulieu nor Colli, scattered along separate roads and unaware of each other's true situation, could do anything to close it again in time. 2 days of brutal, close-quarters fighting followed at Millesimo and Dego, as Bonaparte's divisions pushed hard to widen that gap before either enemy army could recover its balance. At Dego, a young officer named Lanis, a name that would recur throughout the rest of this entire chronicle, led 2 battalions up a steep hillside against Austria's fiercest grenadiers, raising his own hat on the tip of his sword and pressing forward through 2 failed assaults before finally carrying the position on the 3rd attempt, inspiring his exhausted men simply by refusing to stop moving forward himself. By the time the fighting quieted, the combined Austro-Sardinian forces had lost some 8,000 men, most of them captured, along with 30 guns and 15 more banners. Beaulieu himself, riding home in near despair, admitted that his force, nearly 28,000 strong barely a week earlier, had been reduced to some 16,000 men scattered and demoralized, unsure where safety could even be found anymore. With Austria's own army now reeling and cut off from its ally, Bonaparte turned the full weight of his forces westward against Colli's Sardinians alone. Through the 18th and 19th of April, and again on the 22nd near the town of Mondovì, French troops broke Colli's defensive lines outright, driving the Sardinian army into a full retreat toward Turin and inflicting several thousand more casualties along the way. In one of the more memorable images of this short, furious campaign, Serrurier, at 54 years old, the oldest and most weathered division commander in the entire army, a veteran, already of the 7 Years' War, decades earlier, advanced at the very front of his own troops, on foot, sword in hand, walking calmly ahead of his skirmish line through a storm of musket fire, seemingly untouched by fear, in a way that steadied every soldier who watched him do it. Within barely 2 weeks of crossing into Italy, an army that had arrived ragged, unpaid, and widely dismissed by its own enemies had won 6 clear victories in a row, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, its army broken and its capital now dangerously exposed, sued for terms. Negotiations opened at the town of Cherasco, and it was there that Bonaparte revealed, for perhaps the first time in public, just how completely he understood the moment he had already created. When Sardinian negotiators tried to stall for time at the bargaining table, Bonaparte simply glanced at his pocket watch and informed them, without raising his voice, that the order for a general assault had already been given for 2 o'clock that same afternoon, and that unless the fortress of Cuneo was placed in his hands by evening, that assault would proceed exactly on schedule. "I may lose a battle," he told them, "but I will never lose a single minute to overconfidence or carelessness." The armistice was signed that same day. Standing before his soldiers afterward in Cherasco, Bonaparte delivered a second speech, and this one, unlike the first, it was no longer a plea for endurance, but something closer to a victory oration for men who had just done the impossible. "Soldiers," he told them, "in 15 days you have won 6 victories, taken 21 banners and 55 guns, conquered the richest provinces of Piedmont, taken 15,000 prisoners, and killed or wounded 10,000 more of the enemy. You lacked almost everything: food, boots, proper equipment, and yet no obstacle proved too great for you. You have won battles without cannon, crossed rivers without bridges, marched great distances without boots on your feet. Only soldiers of the Republic, only free men," he told them, "could have endured what all of you have just endured." And yet, he reminded them, this triumph was only the beginning. Milan had not yet fallen, nor had Turin, and greater battles still waited for them ahead. He was right to say so. Even as Piedmont's fortresses opened their gates and Sardinia's king signed away his mountain passes for good, the much larger Austrian army, under old Marshal Beaulieu, was already regrouping east of the Po River, determined to hold Lombardy and the road to Milan at any cost. The soldiers who had marched into Italy ragged and unpaid only weeks earlier now turned east, toward a river crossing at a town called Lodi, where the next chapter of their young general's rapid, improbable rise was about to begin. Before Mantua, there was Lodi. Beaulieu's Austrian army, driven back from Piedmont, made its stand behind the Adda River at the town of Lodi in the second week of May, holding a long wooden bridge that offered the only quick crossing for miles. Rather than search for a quieter ford elsewhere, Bonaparte chose to force the bridge directly, massing his artillery on the near bank to smash the Austrian gun line on the far side before sending columns of grenadiers straight down the open span into the teeth of the remaining fire. It was a reckless, almost theatrical way to win a river crossing, and it worked. The bridge was carried. Beaulieu's rearguard scattered, and within days Bonaparte rode into Milan itself to crowds who came out to greet him less like a conquering enemy and more like a man arriving to overturn an old and unloved order. It was a heady, triumphant spring. It would not last undisturbed for long. Beaulieu's broken army fell back east, gathering what remained of itself behind the walls of one last, formidable fortress on the Lombard plain, a city so thoroughly protected by nature itself that European engineers considered it very nearly unconquerable. Its name was Mantua, and the struggle to take it would occupy the better part of the next year. Mantua sat low against the Lombard plain, wrapped almost entirely by the waters of a lake formed where the Mincio River widened and slowed before continuing south toward the Po. The lake curved around the city in the rough shape of a crescent. Its blade turned north, so that Mantua rose from the water like a jewel set into the hollow of a crown. Marshland pressed close against every open approach the lake itself did not cover. 2 friendly fortresses nearby, Peschiera to the north and Legnago to the east, along the same chain of waterways, completed a natural barrier that had made this small stretch of country a battleground for the better part of 100 years, fought over by French and Austrian armies alike during 2 earlier wars over royal succession, decades before Bonaparte was even born. Bonaparte and his own chief engineer both concluded, independently, that the city's true defense lay not in its walls at all, but in the broken, waterlogged ground surrounding it. Ground that made any direct assault a nightmare of drowned roads and collapsing causeways. Characteristically, Bonaparte turned that same logic around. If the terrain made attacking difficult, it made escaping difficult too. Rather than commit the men and heavy guns a proper siege would require, he left barely 7,000 troops to watch the fortress and marched the rest of his army onward, confident the city would eventually starve on its own. It might have worked cleanly had Austria not decided that Italy mattered more to the Habsburg crown than pure military logic could justify. Even as Bonaparte's forces ranged south through the Italian peninsula that summer, the Emperor Francis in Vienna made a costly decision, pulling one of his most experienced field marshals away from the main war effort along the Rhine and sending him south instead. Determined that the double-headed eagle of the Holy Roman Empire would fly again over northern Italy, no matter the price. That marshal's name was Wurmser, and it was against him, over the following months, that the true test of Bonaparte's young command would unfold not across a single decisive afternoon, but across 3 separate campaigns, each one a fresh Austrian army marching down out of the Tyrolean mountains to break the siege, and each one, in turn, drawn instead into open battle on ground that Bonaparte had already chosen. Wurmser's first relief effort came at the end of July, nearly 47,000 men advancing south along 2 separate mountain valleys, splitting his own force further still by sending a secondary column under General Quosdanovich to threaten the French rear near Lake Garda. Bonaparte responded with a decision few commanders of his era would have dared. He abandoned the siege of Mantua outright, leaving his own heavy guns behind rather than risk his mobile field army being caught between 2 advancing Austrian columns, and turned to strike each isolated force before the 2 could ever combine. In the chaotic days that followed, French divisions clashed with scattered Austrian detachments across a dozen small towns around Lake Garda, the fighting so confused and fast-moving that at one point an Austrian officer, sent under a flag of truce to demand the surrender of what he assumed was a substantial French force, was led blindfolded into Bonaparte's own headquarters at Lonato, a position guarded, in truth, by barely 300 men. Bonaparte, drawing on a theatrical flair he rarely let go, entirely unused, feigned outrage at the very suggestion of surrender and gave the startled officer 8 minutes to choose between capitulation and death. The bluff worked completely. The Austrian detachment surrendered without a shot, never realizing how thin the French position actually was. The decisive fighting came days later at the hill town of Castiglione, its approaches studded with old stone redoubts and steep ravines perfectly suited to defense. Wurmser, still convinced his scattered forces could reunite, pressed his main body forward against Augereau's division posted just west of the town, unaware that Bonaparte had spent the previous night quietly positioning Serurier's division to strike the Austrian flank and rear the moment battle was joined. The fighting on the 3rd of August proved brutal and costly on both sides, French officers falling in disturbing numbers as Augereau's men clawed to hold their ground. But when Serurier's hidden division finally struck from the south, Wurmser's nerve broke and he ordered a general withdrawal, convinced wrongly that he was facing a far larger French force than the one actually before him. It was, by Bonaparte's own later account, one of Augereau's finest days of the entire war, and the title later granted him, Duke of Castiglione, commemorated exactly this afternoon of desperate, decisive fighting. Wurmser tried once more, just 2 days after that first repulse, gathering reinforcements and striking again near the same ground, only to be driven back a second time after Bonaparte force-marched Serurier's exhausted division through the night to fall unexpectedly on the Austrian rear a second time in barely 72 hours. Pushed steadily back through Bassano, and a string of smaller engagements through August and September, Wurmser's shattered army finally found its way, battered and half its original strength, back inside the walls of Mantua itself, reinforcing the very garrison it had marched so far to rescue, and giving Bonaparte, in effect, an even larger prize to besiege than before. Austria's third and final attempt to save the fortress came that November under a new commander named Alvinci, advancing once more along two separate mountain routes with the old, familiar Austrian habit of dividing forces that never quite managed to reunite. By this point, exhaustion had settled deep into the army of Italy. Nearly 14,000 men lay sick, another 4,000 wounded, and Bonaparte, riding home in open frustration at the government's failure to send meaningful reinforcement, listed by name the officers already wounded or killed in this long campaign, warning bitterly that soon it would be Augereau's turn, or Massena's, or his own. When two battalions broke and fled without real cause during the opening skirmishes of this new Austrian push, Bonaparte's fury became a public spectacle. Standing before the assembled army, he stripped both units of the right to carry the tricolor at all, ordering their banners inscribed instead with the words that they no longer belonged to the army of Italy. Shamed before their own comrades, the men of both battalions begged to be given the chance to redeem themselves in the fighting still to come, and largely, in the desperate weeks that followed, they did. It was in the marshes east of Verona, around a small causeway village called Arcole, that this last Austrian offensive met its true test. Rather than meet Alvinci's superior numbers head-on, Bonaparte force-marched Augereau's and Massena's divisions south under cover of darkness, crossing the Adige River and swinging around behind the Austrian position to threaten Alvinci's rear and cut his communications with Mantua entirely. The only approach to Arcole itself ran along a single narrow dike, ending at a long wooden bridge defended by a small but stubborn Austrian garrison, and it was across that bridge that some of the fiercest and most chaotic fighting of the entire Italian campaign unfolded across 3 consecutive days. Repeated French assaults broke against the defended bridgehead. Augereau himself seized a regimental banner and led one failed charge personally after his men wavered under the fire. On the second day, Bonaparte rode forward to the bridgehead himself, calling out to the men around him to ask whether they still remembered themselves as the heroes of Lodi, and seized a standard to lead the advance in person, alongside his own aides. In the crush and confusion that followed, with French formations buckling under counterattack, an officer at his side shouted a warning that the general's death here would mean the collapse of the entire army. And moments later, swept backward by his own retreating soldiers, Bonaparte was pushed against the bridge railing and tumbled into the canal below. His brother Louis and his aide Marmont waded into the chaos to pull him free, while a small knot of grenadiers held the panicked Austrian pursuit at bay just long enough to drag their commander to safety. The battle at Arcole ground on for a third exhausting day, before French troops finally forced their way across the bridge and into the village itself, at a cost of well over 1,000 French dead, and more than twice that number wounded, 8 of Bonaparte's own officers killed in the fighting. But the cost proved worth paying. Alvinci's advance had been broken entirely, his shattered forces falling back in disorder, and Wurmser's own attempt to break out from Mantua once news of Arcole reached him simply collapsed before it properly began. Austria made one final effort in January, sending Alvinci forward again toward a plateau above the village of Rivoli, while a second Austrian column probed toward Mantua from another direction, hoping that dividing French attention would finally succeed where dividing Austrian forces had failed so many times before. Bonaparte, alerted late but moving with characteristic speed once he understood the danger, concentrated his scattered divisions on the high ground above Rivoli through the night of the 13th of January, arriving personally at 2 in the morning to study the moonlit battlefield alongside his division commander Joubert. What followed the next day was perhaps the most tactically complete victory of the entire Italian campaign. Austrian columns advancing from multiple directions at once were met, blunted, and then destroyed piece by piece as French reserves arrived at exactly the moments they were needed. A 200-strong cavalry charge scattered one collapsing Austrian wing entirely, and an exploding ammunition wagon in the middle of the Austrian position finished the work of turning retreat into rout. By the time the fighting ended, Alvinci's army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, and with it, Austria's last realistic hope of saving Mantua ended as well. Marshal Wurmser, trapped inside the fortress with his food and his patience both finally exhausted, surrendered the city and its garrison within days. 3 separate Austrian armies, sent one after another, across nearly 7 months to save Mantua, had each in turn been drawn into open battle on ground of Bonaparte's own choosing, and destroyed there a pattern that historians would later come to regard as the true signature of his entire method of war. Not the slow, patient capture of ground for its own sake, favored by an older generation of cautious professional soldiers, but the deliberate, repeated seeking out and destruction of an enemy's field army wherever and however many times it dared to appear. News of Mantua's fall spread back through Paris and every court in Europe, and the young general who 2 years earlier had arrived at Toulon as an unremarkable artillery captain was now, at barely 27, spoken of everywhere as something genuinely new in the history of war, a commander who won, not through numbers or position, but through speed, audacity, and a willingness to gamble everything on a single, perfectly timed strike. It would be nearly a decade before he faced an enemy coalition as ambitious as the one now gathering against him, an alliance of 3 great empires, soon to meet him at a small Moravian town whose name history would forever attach to his most complete and celebrated victory of all. 9 years pass. The young general, who once bled on the ramparts at Arcole, now wears a crown of his own. In the spring of 1805, Bonaparte, now Napoleon, Emperor of the French, stands on the cliffs above the English Channel, watching more than 100,000 men drill and wait in camps along the coast for ships that will carry them across to invade Britain. For over 2 years, the plan has consumed the empire's energy and treasure. It will never actually happen. Word arrives that summer that Austria and Sweden have joined Britain and Russia in a new coalition against him, and by late August, with his own combined fleet already retreating south along the Spanish coast, rather than risking the Channel crossing, the emperor makes a decision that will reshape the following century of European warfare. He turns his entire invasion army east, away from the coast, toward Vienna. Tonight, we follow that turn all the way to its ending, on a frozen Moravian hillside where 3 emperors will meet on the same battlefield and where only one of them will leave it victorious. The army that turns east that August is no longer simply an army. It is something new, which Napoleon has named the Grande Armée, organized into 9 army corps for the first time in a structure that will define the rest of his military career. Bernadotte's corps, of some 15,000 men, Marmont's 20,000, Davout's 25,000, Soult's 28,000, Lanz's 26,000, Ney's 21,000, Augereau's 14,000, the 6,000 men of the Imperial Guard under Bessieres, and Murat's massive reserve cavalry corps of 21,000 horsemen, with another 28,000 Allied German troops besides. In total, some 176,000 men, 20 infantry divisions, 11 cavalry divisions, and 286 field guns, begin a march of over 600 kilometers toward the Rhine. A march that older military tradition assumed would take more than 40 days to complete. Nearly the entire army does it in barely 20. By early October, the Grande Armée has crossed the Danube and begun its assault on the Austrian positions. Napoleon ordering Bernadotte's corps through neutral Prussian territory near Ansbach despite Bernadotte's own strong objections, a shortcut that speeds the encirclement considerably even as it quietly poisons Prussia's mood toward France for months afterward. The Austrian High Command, still expecting the French to arrive at the earliest by the 10th of November, is caught devastatingly off guard. On the 20th of October, at the fortress town of Ulm, an entire Austrian army, 16 generals, over 23,000 soldiers, 60 guns, files past Napoleon in person and lays down its weapons almost without a real battle having been fought at all. One French exile, serving in the Austrian ranks, writes bitterly in his private diary that the shame of that surrender would never wash clean. The celebration does not last a single day. On the 21st, word reaches the French camp that the combined French and Spanish fleets have been utterly shattered off the coast of Spain at a place called Trafalgar by the British Admiral Nelson. At sea, French ambitions have just been broken for a generation. On land, meanwhile, the situation only grows more urgent by the week a Russian army, under the veteran commander Kutuzov, has already crossed into Austrian territory. Gathering the beaten remnants of Austria's own forces as it comes, while far to the south, Austria's most capable field commander slips away from the weaker French forces watching him in Italy and begins falling back to defend his own homeland. Worst of all, Prussia's fury over the violation of its neutral territory at Ansbach is hardening by the day into open talk of joining the coalition outright. Napoleon pushes forward regardless, entering Vienna itself on the 14th of November, the first time in centuries any foreign army has taken the ancient imperial capital. And the Austrian Emperor Francis has already fled east to Moravia rather than risk capture. Napoleon takes up quarters in the opulent halls of Schönbrunn Palace, and more importantly, in the city's overflowing supply depots, capturing enough muskets and ammunition to equip several fresh army corps, along with vast stores of flour, fodder, and wine. Wine so plentiful that within days, the French garrison in the captured city is drawing on it at a rate of several hundred barrels every single day. An irony not lost on the increasingly hungry Russian and Austrian troops watching their own supply lines collapse further north. Kutuzov, for his part, proves a maddeningly difficult opponent to pin down. Rather than stand and fight for Vienna, he withdraws steadily northward across the Danube, burning bridges behind him to slow French pursuit, and even manages, in the confusion of retreat, to spring an ambush that very nearly destroys an entire fresh French division sent to cut off his path. Napoleon's first real taste of just how dangerous this quiet, unassuming, old Russian general could be. By late November, the shattered remnants of Austria's field army and Kutuzov's own force, reinforced now by a fresh column of Russian guards under the personal command of the young Tsar Alexander himself, finally halt their long retreat and take up a strong defensive position near the town of Olmütz, roughly 60 kilometers from Napoleon's own forward positions at Brünn. It is there, in the Allied camp, that the argument over what to do next grows genuinely bitter. Kutuzov and the more cautious, battle-scarred Austrian officers, who have already tasted defeat at Napoleon's hands, argue strongly for patience to retreat further if pressed. Wait for Archduke Charles's army to arrive from Italy. Wait even for Prussia to formally join the war in mid-December, and only then consider attacking. The young Tsar and his more excitable staff officers flush with a sense of numerical advantage, and convinced that Napoleon's own army, worn down by weeks of marching and stretched thin by detachments left behind at Vienna, was near collapse, argue for immediate attack. It does not help matters that the coalition supply situation at Olmütz is already growing desperate, nearly 90,000 men consuming supplies faster than exhausted wagon trains can replace them, while the wine cellars of occupied Vienna, which by rights belonged to Austria, were instead being emptied nightly by French soldiers only a few days' march away. Impatient, proud, and eager to avenge what many at court whispered was Napoleon's own recent public insinuation about his late father's suspicious death, the young Tsar overruled his own general and gave the order: advance on Brünn. Napoleon, watching this decision unfold from his own camp with something close to relief, had in fact spent the preceding days working hard to encourage exactly this outcome. He deliberately pulled his forward units back from strong positions, let his soldiers appear tired and eager for peace, and sent his own aide to the Allied camp with a formal request for a personal meeting with the Tsar to discuss terms. Alexander, convinced that no truly desperate general would ever grovel for such a meeting unless his position were hopeless, coldly refused to meet Napoleon in person at all, sending only a junior aide for what amounted to a token, dismissive negotiation. The reaction in the Allied camp was almost gleeful. Word spread that the French emperor had lost his nerve entirely, that his army was exhausted and finished, that the moment to crush him once and for all had finally arrived. It was exactly the reaction Napoleon had been counting on. His apparent weakness was theater from the very beginning, staged deliberately to draw the combined Russian and Austrian army toward attacking his seemingly thin and vulnerable right flank, a stretch of frozen ponds and marshland below a plateau called the Pratzen Heights, high ground that Napoleon had studied personally weeks earlier while pursuing Kutuzov north, and had already privately told his own officers he intended to fight a decisive battle upon. Let the Allies commit their main strength against that flank, drawing their own center dangerously thin across the heights in the process. And Napoleon's hidden central reserve, held back out of sight in the river valley below, would then storm forward and seize the abandoned high ground before the Allies could react, wheeling south from there to crush the overextended Allied left between two French forces like metal caught between hammer and anvil. On the night before the battle, Napoleon rode the length of his army's camp, addressing the men directly, promising them that victory here would let them winter in comfortable quarters and return home with the peace France deserved. His soldiers, marking both the eve of decisive battle and the first anniversary of his own coronation, answered him by binding straw into torches, lighting them, and waving them through the darkness in his honor as he passed, shouting that they would seize enemy banners and cannon as a gift to celebrate his crowning, that they would make the Russian bear dance to their own rhythm before this was over. Moved, Napoleon addressed them once more, promising that he would personally direct every battalion himself, that he would remain safely behind the lines only so long as their own courage carried the day without him, but that if fortune wavered for even a single instant, the Emperor of the French would stand in the very front line and lead the attack himself. Watching the distant torchlight and hearing the roar of "Long live the Emperor" rolling across the valley, the Allied camp mistook the display entirely, convincing themselves it meant Napoleon's army was already burning its own camp and preparing to retreat. At dawn on the 2nd of December, thick fog blanketed the frozen ground as some 73,000 French soldiers stood ready in silence, while across the valley, Russian troops in green and Austrian troops in white advanced along a 12-kilometer front. History would remember it as the Battle of the Three Emperors, since armies here fought in the name of three crown rulers, Napoleon, the Austrian Emperor Francis, and the Russian Tsar Alexander, though, in truth, a fourth crown stood quietly upon that same field that morning, since Francis of Austria also still held, in fading ceremony only, the ancient title of Holy Roman Emperor. Exactly as Napoleon had gambled, the Allied main force threw itself against his apparently weak southern flank in the early hours, exposing the Pratzen Heights at the Allied center almost precisely on schedule. Near 9 in the morning, as the fog finally began to burn away under the winter sun, Napoleon watched the heights above him grow visibly thinner of defenders and gave the order. Marshal Soult's division surged up the slope and seized the high ground before Allied reserves could properly respond. 2 hours of brutal, close fighting followed, as first the Russian Tsar and then old Kutuzov himself threw every available reserve back up the same slope in a desperate effort to retake it. 4 separate assaults, breaking one after another against French lines that, however hard-pressed, refused to give the position back. It was near the eastern edge of that same high ground, in the ruins of an old vineyard, that one of the day's strangest and most dramatic scenes unfolded, a clash not merely of ordinary regiments, but of the two empires' own household guards. Russian Imperial Guard cavalry, thrown into the gap by the young Grand Duke Constantine, broke through one French infantry square entirely and captured its eagle standard outright, and came within a hair of doing the same to a second before French Imperial Guard cavalry under Marshal Bessières arrived at the gallop, sabers drawn, shouting as they closed the distance that they would make the ladies of the Russian court weep before the day was through. What followed was, in more than a merely symbolic sense, a fight between Napoleon's own household troops and the Tsar's, and by the time the melee ended, the elite Russian cavalry regiment had been broken so completely that of one entire squadron, barely a handful of riders survived the encounter unwounded or uncaptured. By 3 in the afternoon, the Allied center and north had collapsed entirely, leaving only the Allied left, still fighting desperately in the southern lowlands, dangerously exposed, with the newly captured Pratzen Heights now looming over its own rear. Napoleon turned his guns and his reserves south in one final, overwhelming push, and Allied troops trapped between the heights and a string of frozen ponds broke and fled across the ice itself, French artillery firing directly onto the frozen surface as retreating soldiers and, more often, their heavy draft horses and gun carriages plunged through the shattered ice into the freezing water below. By nightfall, the coalition army lay broken beyond any hope of reorganizing, having lost some 27,000 men and 180 guns in a single afternoon, a third of that number taken prisoner outright. Kutuzov himself was wounded and very nearly captured in the chaos, and both emperors, Francis and Alexander, escaped only because their own frightened staff abandoned them along the retreat road rather than risking capture alongside them. The following morning, Napoleon addressed his exhausted soldiers once more, telling them plainly that in a single day they had accomplished everything he had asked of their courage, that an army of 100,000 men, commanded in the name of 2 emperors, had been utterly broken in under 4 hours, and that they need only say, for the rest of their lives, that they had fought at Austerlitz, and every listener would answer them with genuine admiration. The rewards that followed proved immense. Austria's emperor sued for terms within 2 days. When Prussia's own envoy arrived at French headquarters days later, having been sent, before the battle, to deliver something close to an ultimatum on Austria's behalf, he instead found himself congratulating Napoleon on his victory and proposing an alliance, prompting Napoleon's own dry, pointed reply that fortune, it seemed, had simply changed the address to which the envoy's congratulations were meant to be delivered. By late December, Austria formally withdrew from the coalition, and Francis renounced the ancient title of Holy Roman Emperor entirely, ending, in the aftermath of a single winter afternoon on a Moravian hillside, an imperial title that had endured in one form or another for nearly 1,000 years. To commemorate the victory, Napoleon would later order the construction of a great triumphal monument in Paris, meant to welcome home returning soldiers of glory still to come, a monument that would take 3 decades to finish, eventually bearing the name of Austerlitz alongside 95 other victories carved into its stone, and standing today as the Arc de Triomphe. But glory of this size draws challengers of its own. Even as church bells rang out across Paris that winter, one power that had watched this entire campaign unfold from the sidelines was already beginning, slowly and with considerable wounded pride, to reconsider its own position, a kingdom that still remembered itself as the proud inheritor of an old and celebrated military tradition, and one that would not remain a bystander for very much longer. The smoke of Austerlitz has barely cleared before a new challenger steps forward. In September of the following year, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden band together into a fourth coalition against France, and this time it is Prussia, commanding nearly 200,000 regular troops from a kingdom of some 10 million people, that steps forward as the true backbone of the alliance. Prussia's confidence in this fight comes from one particular source above all others: the memory of Frederick the Great, the very king Napoleon himself had idolized as a young cadet, and of one battle in particular, fought half a century earlier, near a village called Rossbach, where Frederick's army had once destroyed a much larger French and imperial force in barely 90 minutes. So thoroughly and so quickly that many Prussian infantrymen never even fired a shot before the battle was already won. Prussian officers, certain that Napoleon had only ever defeated feeble Italians, soft Austrians, and clumsy Russians, told each other openly that a truly determined Prussian army would finally teach this Corsican upstart the lesson Rossbach had once taught his own nation. What none of them fully reckoned with was how badly rot had already set into the very army they were so proud of. The glittering discipline of Frederick's era had curdled over decades of peace and neglect into a system riddled with quiet corruption. Company commanders who pocketed the pay of soldiers they routinely sent home on unofficial leave to save money, recruiting officers who filled the ranks with the cheapest and most disreputable men available because cheaper recruits meant fatter bribes. Muskets so poorly made that veteran soldiers openly called them the unluckiest weapon a man could be handed. And a training regime so obsessed with parade ground speed that ordinary infantrymen frequently went an entire year firing only a handful of live rounds, if they fired any at all. The French army, by grim contrast, drilled its ordinary soldiers with real ammunition regularly, and had spent a full generation perfecting a flexible new style of fighting, built around skirmishers who fought from cover in loose, mutually supporting groups. A tactic French soldiers from the hills and forests of home had always been naturally gifted at, and won the stiff, parade-perfect Prussian infantry had almost no meaningful answer for. Tonight, we watch what happens when the glittering reputation of Frederick's old army finally collides with the reality of what it has quietly become and with the army Napoleon has built to replace it. Napoleon moves against Prussia with a preparation so thorough and a strike so sudden that the campaign feels, almost from its first days, like a foregone conclusion. 6 French army corps advanced together as 3 great parallel columns pouring north through the narrow forest roads of the Thuringian hills, each soldier carrying 4 days of rations on his own back, with corps quartermasters carrying still more behind. Marshal Augereau's corps covers an average of nearly 40 kilometers a day for 9 consecutive days. Marshal Lannes's corps covers over 100 kilometers in barely 2. Prussian columns, by grim contrast, rarely manage more than 24 kilometers in a single day, a gap in sheer marching speed that, by itself, already tells much of the story to come. In one of the campaign's earliest and saddest encounters, a small, eager column of Prussian and Saxon troops, under the young, hot-blooded Prince Louis Ferdinand, a cousin of the king, and one of the war's loudest advocates, is caught and utterly destroyed near Saalfeld, the prince himself refusing every demand to surrender, even as his own force collapsed around him, cutting down a French officer with his own saber before being killed in the same exchange. One final act of doomed, romantic defiance that will be mourned across Prussia within days. By the 13th of October, Marshal Lannes has occupied the town of Jena itself and reports sighting a substantial body of Prussian troops on the high plateau just west of the town. Napoleon rides ahead in person to see for himself, reaching a low hill northwest of Jena within the hour and observing the Prussian positions with his own eyes in the fading afternoon light. Convinced the coming battle would be fought on this very plateau, he spends that same night by the light of his own campfire, dictating detailed orders for the following dawn from memory alone. No proper map of the ground was yet available, so his instructions referred simply to a plateau, a village to the right, features he had noted with his own eyes hours before and had no time to survey more carefully. Later that night, torches lit and voices raised deliberately, Napoleon rode once more along his own assembled lines, greeted everywhere by roaring cheers that carried clear across the valley into the Prussian camp beyond, and Prussian soldiers listening to that distant roar, remembering exactly what such scenes had preceded a year earlier at Austerlitz, found themselves shivering at the memory alone. What neither commander fully understood that night was that each had made the very same mistake about the other. Napoleon believed he had found the main Prussian army arrayed before him at Jena. In truth, it was only a portion of it under Prince Hohenlohe, while the true main Prussian force, under the aging Duke of Brunswick and the king himself, lay encamped a considerable distance away near a town called Auerstedt, entirely unaware that Napoleon himself, rather than some lesser detachment, stood only a few kilometers off. At dawn on the 14th, French troops advanced on the plateau above Jena in thick, cold fog, seizing 3 key villages within a few hours and securing enough open ground to bring their full weight to bear. It was in the middle of this careful, methodical build-up that things briefly threatened to unravel. Marshal Ney, hearing the sound of fighting ahead and desperately afraid of missing his share of the coming battle, pushed forward on his own initiative with barely 3,000 men, far ahead of the rest of the army, and was quickly surrounded by converging Prussian cavalry near the village of Viersen-Heiligen. Napoleon, learning that Ney had advanced with only a fraction of his corps, reacted at once. throwing his only two available cavalry regiments into the gap and ordering Lanz's own corps to accelerate its advance in support until Ney's isolated troops, after desperate, close fighting, were finally relieved and pulled back into the main French line. From there, the battle turned steadily and then overwhelmingly in France's favor. One British officer who studied the battle closely afterward, an admirer of the Prussian army by his own account, described what followed as one of the strangest and most tragic sights in the whole history of war. An entire Prussian infantry formation, some 20,000 strong and magnificent to look at, standing exposed in open ground for nearly 2 full hours under relentless French skirmish fire, unable to find any clear target to fire back at as French soldiers picked them apart from behind walls, hedges, and scattered stands of trees, until the ground around them lay thick with dead and wounded, and only a scattered handful of men still even attempted to return fire. Prussian regiments, trained for a lifetime to stand and volley in perfect parade ground lines, simply had no answer for an enemy that refused to stand still and be shot at in the open. By early afternoon, with French troops pouring around both of his flanks and his last reserves already spent, Prince Hohenlohe accepted that the position was lost and ordered a general retreat that quickly collapsed into a rout. French cavalry harrying the fleeing Prussians for miles along the road toward Weimar. Yet Jena, for all its scale, was not even the day's most remarkable battle. Riding back into Jena that evening, entirely satisfied that he had just crushed the main Prussian army, Napoleon was met by a staff officer from Marshal Davout's corps, who had been waiting for him with news from an entirely different battlefield, some 20 kilometers away. Davout's corps, the officer reported, had that same morning encountered and utterly defeated the actual main Prussian army, 60,000 men under the Duke of Brunswick himself, with the Prussian king present in person near the town of Austerlitz. Napoleon, certain the young officer had simply confused one enemy detachment for another, laughed and told him bluntly that his marshal must have seen one man and mistaken him for two. But the report was entirely true. Davout, with barely 26,000 men of his own, had spent that same foggy morning fighting off repeated Prussian attacks near the village of Hassenhausen, holding his ground through wave after wave of Prussian assault, even as both the Duke of Brunswick and, soon after, another senior Prussian general fell mortally wounded trying to break the French line by sheer force. By early afternoon, with his flanking divisions finally arriving to envelop both Prussian wings, Davout had broken an army more than twice the size of his own. One of the single most lopsided tactical victories of the entire war, achieved not by Napoleon himself, but by the quiet, nearsighted, almost unassuming marshal that history would come to regard as perhaps the single most reliably brilliant commander Napoleon ever had at his disposal. The twin disasters at Jena and Auerstedt, falling on the very same day, broke something in Prussia that never fully recovered. Fortress after fortress surrendered in the weeks that followed, with barely a shot fired, as though the shock of that single October day had drained the will to resist out of an entire kingdom at once. On the 27th of October, barely 2 weeks after the campaign began, Napoleon entered Berlin itself as a conqueror, and in the royal palace he found and claimed for himself the sword, sash, and decorations that had once belonged to Frederick the Great, sending them back to Paris to be kept among France's own military honors, along with the very monument Frederick had erected in Berlin to commemorate his own victory at Rossbach half a century before. Within another 2 weeks, the last significant Prussian field commander still resisting had likewise surrendered, and what had, only a month earlier, called itself Europe's finest army had ceased, for all practical purposes, to exist. It would later be said, not entirely in jest, that Napoleon had needed only a single breath to blow the whole of Prussia down. Yet even as Prussia's army disintegrated entirely, the war itself refused to end. Far to the east, a new and considerably more stubborn opponent was already on the march, the army of Tsar Alexander's Russia, advancing at last to honor its alliance with the shattered Prussians. Winter was closing in fast across the plains of East Prussia and Poland, and the campaign that followed would be fought not on the gentle plateau above Jena, but in driving snow and freezing wind, on a battlefield where courage alone, more than any clever maneuver, would be asked to carry the day. By the last days of January 1807, Napoleon had hoped to settle his exhausted army into winter quarters and let the campaign rest until spring. It was not to be. The Russian general Bennigsen, still eager to avenge Austerlitz, began pushing west through the snow that same month, threatening the forward French supply base at Thorn, on which 2 entire corps depended for food and ammunition. Rather than wait for the threat to grow, Napoleon decided to strike first, even in the dead of a Polish winter. Tonight, we follow that decision into one of the strangest and, by his own soldier's account, single bloodiest days of his entire career, a battle fought largely inside a blinding snowstorm, remembered less for who won than for what it cost. The road to that battle ran first through a smaller, fiercer fight at a town called Hof, where Marshal Murat's cavalry, screening the army's advance, caught up with a Russian rearguard of some 7,000 men under a young Scottish-descended general named Barclay de Tolly, a name that history would meet again on a far larger stage 5 years later. The fighting at Hof turned into one of the more theatrical cavalry actions of the entire war. French and Russian hussars closed to within pistol range and abruptly halted, each side sending forward a single champion officer to duel before the main clash, an old chivalric custom that briefly still lingered even in this new industrial-scale kind of war. When the French officer fell from his saddle, emboldened Russian hussars surged forward and briefly tore open the French line. It took a charge by France's own armored heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers, wrapped in steel breastplates that could turn aside a saber blow or even a spent pistol ball to finally break the Russian position, their commanding general shouting to his men as he led them in that he wanted his heavy-booted, iron-clad riders to go through the enemy the way a boot goes through soft butter. The main battle came 2 days later, near the small East Prussian town of Eylau itself, on the night before. In a vicious, confused fight simply over which army would hold the town to shelter from the cold, both sides lost 4,000 or 5,000 men apiece before Russian forces finally withdrew to a fortified rise just outside it. Napoleon arrived personally that same night to take command, discovering that his own numbers were badly short of what the coming battle required. Some 56,000 men and 140 guns against a Russian force of nearly 67,000 with over 260 guns, since Marshal Ney's and Marshal Davout's corps, meant to close in on the Russian flanks, were still marching hard through the snow and would not arrive for hours yet, and the messenger meant to summon Marshal Bernadotte's corps entirely had been captured by Russian cavalry along the way, ensuring nearly 20,000 additional French troops would never reach the field at all. At dawn on the 8th of February, in driving snow, both armies' guns opened up almost simultaneously, filling the frozen air with what one French officer would later call a hurricane of death, sweeping and shattering everything in its path. Rather than wait for Davout's corps to arrive as originally planned, Napoleon ordered an early attack by Marshal Augereau's corps to relieve the pressure building on his own center. Augereau himself, 49 years old and suffering badly from acute rheumatism that morning, had originally intended to direct the attack from a sled, but chose in the end to mount his horse and lead the charge in person. It proved to be one of the costliest decisions of the entire war. A sudden blinding squall of snow swallowed his advancing divisions whole, blinding soldiers so completely that entire regiments lost their bearing and drifted steadily leftward, away from their intended line, until the storm finally thinned just long enough to reveal that they had marched, entirely by accident, directly into the muzzles of a 72-gun Russian battery at point-blank range. Because the wind blew from behind the Russian gunners rather than into their faces, Russian artillery crews could see and aim with terrible precision, even as French gunners behind their own infantry could barely see anything at all. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter. Russian dragoons and hussars poured into the gaps, torn open by their own artillery, catching French infantry regiments still in marching column rather than properly formed to receive cavalry. One French regiment, the 44th, was overrun so completely that when its own soldiers returned the next day to gather the dead, they found the fallen men still arranged in the rough outline of the square formation they had never quite managed to complete, cut down exactly where the gap in their own ranks had let the Russian horsemen through. A second French regiment, the 14th, made its own desperate stand on a small rise, its colonel killed outright. Its 1st Battalion, holding formation under crushing pressure from both Russian infantry and repeated cavalry charges, even as its sister battalion fell back to safety elsewhere. Watching through his own field glass from a distant hilltop, Napoleon spotted this one stubborn battalion still holding out amid the general collapse and ordered Augereau to save them if any way could be found. 2 separate messengers sent to guide them back were cut down by Russian cavalry before they ever arrived. A third messenger, a young officer, barely in his 20s, somehow cut his way through the Russian horsemen to reach them, only to find the position already hopeless the battalion's acting commander, watching Russian grenadiers close the final distance, handed him the regiment's eagle standard to carry to safety rather than let it fall into enemy hands. And the surrounded soldiers answered with one final defiant shout of "Long live the Emperor!" as Russian troops closed in around them. By nightfall, of nearly 1,900 men that battalion had begun the day with, barely 500 remained fit to fight the single heaviest loss suffered by any unit in Augereau's entire shattered corps. A corps that, by evening, had, in the words of one surviving French officer, simply blown apart like snow scattered by wind. With his center now torn open and his infantry reserves already spent, Napoleon turned to the only force still capable of a decisive blow, his massed cavalry reserve, held under Marshal Murat. Watching a wall of advancing Russian infantry through the drifting snow, Napoleon turned to his cavalry commander and asked him bluntly whether he intended to let these men simply swallow them whole. Murat needed no further instruction. Raising his riding crop, rather than the curved Ottoman saber he carried but rarely drew, he called out for the men to follow him in the emperor's name, and spurred his own horse forward at the head of some 5,000 assembled horsemen, cuirassiers, in steel breastplates, dragoons, chasseurs hastily gathered from whatever units stood nearest at hand. They rode out across the snow-covered plain in one enormous body, thundering straight through the retreating remnants of Augereau's own broken corps, the ground itself seeming to shake under thousands of hooves at once, every rider shouting the same cry as they closed the distance. "Rally to the Marshal! Long live the Emperor!" The charge tore into the Russian lines with tremendous force, breaking through in more than one place before Russian infantry, recovering their nerve, reformed into solid lines, and drove the exhausted French horsemen back with disciplined volley fire. The elite Imperial Guard cavalry, thrown in afterward to rescue what remained of Murat's spent charge, fought its own desperate and costly action deep inside the Russian position. One small detachment of guard cavalry, led by a colonel named Lepik, finding itself cut off entirely behind enemy lines. Surrounded by Russian infantry and Cossacks, a Russian officer calling out for them to surrender since their own courage, he said, had carried them too far behind Russian lines to ever fight their way out. Lepik's reported answer, delivered before he ordered his own men to charge straight through the surrounding Russians rather than surrender, asked simply whether the faces around him looked like men who wished to surrender at all. Of the small detachment he personally led into that encirclement, barely 30 men would make it back to French lines that evening, and when Napoleon later embraced Lepik in front of the assembled guard, confessing that he had feared the entire detachment, lost or surrendered, Lepik answered that the emperor would only ever hear news of their deaths, never of their surrender. The fighting around Napoleon's own command post, set up amid the gravestones of Eylau's small cemetery, grew dangerous enough at one point that his personal escort had to be replaced several times over as Russian artillery found the range, and a detachment of several thousand disoriented Russian infantry, having lost their own bearings in the chaos, blundered directly toward the emperor's own position before French Imperial Guard infantry finally intercepted and destroyed them in brutal, close hand-to-hand fighting. Neither side seemed willing to end with mere gunfire. Through all of it, witnesses would later recall, Napoleon himself never once left his position on the hill, remaining still and outwardly calm, even as Russian infantry closed to within a few dozen paces of where he stood, murmuring only what fine courage this was, again and again, as if unable to look away from the spectacle of it. By early afternoon, both sides had fought each other to a near standstill. Thousands of cavalrymen and thousands more infantry spent on both sides with nothing decisive to show for it. It was Marshal Davout's long-delayed corps finally arriving and driving hard into the Russian left flank, that briefly threatened to break the deadlock until Prussian reinforcements under General Lestock arrived just in time that afternoon to blunt Davout's advance and stabilize the collapsing Russian line. Marshal Ney's corps, the last to reach the field, arrived only as darkness fell, its exhausted soldiers finding a landscape that defied description, the snow for acres in every direction stained dark, littered with the dead and the dying alike, men slowly freezing where they had fallen. Ney himself, surveying the wreckage, is remembered to have said only that, "What a slaughter this had been, and to so little purpose." By the time the fighting finally guttered out, French losses may have reached 20 to 30,000 men, by far the bloodiest single day of Napoleon's career. To that point, with Russian losses running roughly as high, and more still would die of cold and untreated wounds in the days that followed, as both exhausted armies struggled simply to keep their remaining soldiers alive through the freezing nights ahead. The Russian army withdrew from the field the next morning, leaving Napoleon in nominal possession of the ground, though at a cost so heavy that almost no one in his own army was inclined to call it a real triumph. What lingers longest from Eylau, more than any single tactical lesson, is the image of that battlefield the next morning's snow, stained dark for acres in every direction. The frozen ground, littered with men and horses who would never rise again. An emperor riding slowly across the wreckage in silence, having won a field that had cost him far more than he had ever intended to pay. It is, in its way, a preview of something larger and far more terrible still to come, a warning. Though few around him fully register it as one, of what winter, distance, and a stubborn enemy willing to trade blood for time might one day cost an army marching even further from home. 5 years pass before that warning is fully understood. By then, the emperor who once bled on the ramparts of Toulon and who commanded the frozen chaos at Eylau will be leading the largest army Europe has ever assembled, deep into the heart of Russia itself, toward a village whose name history will remember as the single bloodiest day of the entire age. It is the 24th of June, 1812, and along the banks of the Niemen River, the largest army Europe has ever assembled begins crossing into Russian territory, over 600,000 men in total. French corps troops alongside German, Polish, Italian, Swiss, and even some Spanish and Portuguese contingents drawn from across Napoleon's sprawling empire, the true French-born soldiers among them numbering perhaps only 250,000 out of the whole. It is an army built on a scale meant to end the war before it can properly begin. Tonight, we follow that army deep into Russia, to a quiet village on the road to Moscow, where, on a single September day, more men will fall in a few hours than in almost any battle fought before it. Napoleon had prepared for this invasion with a thoroughness that, in hindsight, makes what followed almost darkly ironic. Since the start of the year, vast supply depots had been stocked along the frontier, enough grain and fodder for 400,000 men and 50,000 horses for 50 days, hauled forward by a supply train of more than 32,000 wagons and nearly 200,000 draft horses, a logistical undertaking without precedent in the history of European warfare to that point. And yet none of it proved remotely sufficient. Marching an army this size simply outran what any wagon train of the age could sustain, no matter how carefully planned by one estimate. Even moving at a punishing 30 kilometers a day, the supply convoys could deliver barely half of what the army actually consumed, and roughly a third of the wagon's own capacity went toward feeding the horses, hauling the wagons themselves. It was not, in the end, the famous Russian winter that broke this army first. Contrary to the popular legend, the winter of that year arrived unusually late and mild, the first real snow not falling until early November, weeks after the retreat from Moscow had already begun. The truth was less dramatic and considerably more mundane. It was the Russian summer that did the deepest damage, weeks of scorching heat by day and torrential rain by night. Roads, first choking men and horses in dust, and then swallowing wagons whole in mud, while typhus, dysentery, and heat stroke picked off exhausted soldiers by the thousand before a single major battle had even been fought. Even the widely repeated legend that French army-issue tin buttons crumbled to powder in the cold, leaving soldiers to freeze without proper closures on their coats, turns out, on closer inspection, to be simply untrue. Modern excavations of the campaign's battlefields have recovered buttons perfectly intact, their regimental numbers still legible more than 2 centuries later. The march east was punishing from its very first weeks regardless. Within less than 2 months, by the middle of August, the core French force had already reached Smolensk and had already lost 100,000 men to straggling, disease, hunger, and desertion, without having fought a single major battle. The Allied contingents, often supplied and cared for far worse than the French troops themselves, suffered even more grievously, losing something closer to 150,000 men in the same span, though their cavalry units, drawn largely from German and Polish horsemen more practiced in caring for their mounts on campaign, held together somewhat better than their infantry. By the time the army finally neared the village of Borodino in early September, the more than 600,000 men Napoleon had originally gathered for this invasion had already been reduced by nearly half. On the day of the battle itself, the core French and Allied force actually available to Napoleon numbered barely 130,000 men. Facing him was the veteran Russian commander Kutuzov, a man who had spent a lifetime studying warfare and had, until now, spent this entire campaign trading space for time, retreating steadily eastward rather than risking his army in open battle. But Moscow lay only a little more than 100 kilometers beyond Borodino now, and neither the Russian army nor the Russian court could accept surrendering the ancient capital without a fight. On the 5th of September, 2 days before the main battle, French troops under Marshal Davout and Prince Poniatowski stormed a forward Russian earthwork called the Shevardino Redoubt in brutal fighting that cost both sides roughly equal heavy losses. When Napoleon later asked after the whereabouts of one particular French battalion that had been all but wiped out taking that position, its colonel is remembered to have answered simply that it was lying now inside the redoubt itself. The main battle opened at dawn on the 7th of September. Nearly 600 field guns between the two armies, opening fire almost simultaneously, a concentration of artillery that no battlefield in Europe had ever witnessed at such density before. The bloodiest fighting of the entire day erupted almost immediately around a cluster of Russian earthworks known as the Bagration Flèche, arrow-shaped redoubts anchoring the southern end of the Russian line. Leading the French assault was General Compiègne's division, its lead regiment carrying a nickname earned through long service and a fearsome reputation among its own army, the Terrible. A senior Russian artillery officer defending the position wrote afterward that his own gunners' fire proved so relentless that the advancing French columns visibly thinned with every fresh reinforcement thrown into the attack, and that the harder the French pressed, the faster their own losses seemed to mount. Watching the ferocity of that first French assault from a distance, the Russian commander defending the sector, Prince Bagration himself, is said to have applauded openly at the sight of such raw courage in his own enemy, calling out, "Bravo, bravo," even as his own gunners tore the attacking ranks apart. The Flèche changed hands again and again through the morning, seized by one furious French assault, only to be retaken by an equally furious Russian counterattack minutes later. The crude earthworks offering little real shelter to whichever side momentarily held them, since their open backs left defenders just as exposed as attackers. Prince Bagration himself, dressed in his full formal uniform, eventually rode forward to lead a counterattack in person, and it was in this same fighting that he was struck by a shell fragment that shattered the bone in his leg, a wound from which he would die 6 days later. One Russian officer of the 2nd Combined Grenadier Division, himself severely wounded in the same fighting, later wrote that his entire division of 4,000 men had ceased to exist within a single hour of combat, reduced to barely 300 survivors, adding, with a kind of grim pride, that if anyone asked the next day where his unit could be found, he would point to the very ground they had died defending, and say simply, "There." It was only on the 6th French assault, backed by over 350 guns concentrated on the position, that the Flèche finally and permanently fell into French hands, more than 4 hours after the fighting had first begun. The struggle then shifted north to the Raevski Redoubt, a fortified rise the French called simply the Great Redoubt, where French infantry stormed the position amid smoke so thick that the Russian general defending it, Raevski, later admitted he had no idea French troops had even reached the earthwork's own walls until an aide shouted a warning, and he saw their bayonets already gleaming through the haze just a few paces away. Captured briefly in savage hand-to-hand fighting inside the cramped earthwork itself, the redoubt was retaken by a determined Russian counterattack within the hour. The French regiment that had first stormed it, some 3,000 strong at the start of the day, reduced afterward to less than 300 men able to answer roll call. It would take a massed cavalry charge that afternoon. French, Polish, Saxon, and Westphalian cuirassiers riding together in a single overwhelming wave to finally break the position for good, a charge so audacious that one French officer, watching from a distance, genuinely believed the fortified position had been shattered by artillery fire alone before the cavalry ever arrived to finish the job. General Caulaincourt, leading part of that decisive charge, was killed at the very moment of breakthrough, and when Napoleon was told the news, he said only that his friend had died as a warrior ought to, deciding the fate of the battle with his own life. Through it all, entire formations on both sides that were not directly engaged in the fighting simply stood in their ranks and endured hours of enemy artillery fire without any ability to answer it, a discipline that both armies displayed in equal, almost unbearable measure. Murat's own cavalry reserve stood motionless behind the French guns for nearly 3 hours under Russian artillery fire, watching entire files of horsemen cut down where they stood without ever charging at all. On the Russian side, entire infantry divisions arranged in dense columns on the forward slope of their own position, fully visible to French gunners the whole time, simply closed ranks and stepped forward to fill each gap torn open by artillery fire. One Russian general later noting, with something like astonishment, that his own men, though visibly thinned by hours of bombardment, held their ground in place without so much as flinching, exactly as though they stood on parade rather than under fire. When French cavalry finally captured the redoubt for good in the mid-afternoon, one of Napoleon's own staff officers, watching through a field glass, cried out in triumph that Saxon cuirassiers had broken through and taken the position only for Napoleon to take the same glass, look for himself, and coldly correct him. He must be mistaken, he said. Those must be his own French cuirassiers instead. It was, in its own small and telling way, exactly the kind of moment that revealed how little glory Napoleon was willing to share even with allies who had bled just as freely as his own countrymen that day. By late afternoon, both exhausted armies had fought each other to something close to a standstill. Napoleon, with his elite imperial guard still fresh and uncommitted, chose not to throw them into the fight to finish what many around him believed could have been a truly decisive, war-ending victory, a decision that most of his own senior marshals, including Berthier and Murat, actually supported at the time, wary of risking his last reserve so deep inside hostile territory. Kutuzov, for his part, quietly ordered his own battered army to withdraw from the field overnight, slipping away toward Moscow before dawn, leaving Napoleon in possession of the ground, but without the shattering, war-ending victory. His entire method of war had always depended on delivering. The cost of that single day proved almost impossible to comprehend even by the standards of an already brutal war. Russian records list somewhere between 44 and 52,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, along with 23 generals. Entire regiments were reduced to fragments of their original strength. One colonel asking after a unit's identity and being told simply, "We are the 2nd Division," as though nothing more specific remained to distinguish it. French losses ran to somewhere near 35,000 men, including an extraordinarily high toll of 49 generals, a casualty rate among senior officers nearly double the Russian army's own. Since French commanders traditionally led from close behind the front lines rather than from the rear, Napoleon himself, reflecting afterward on the entire campaign, would later say that in his whole career, no battle had frightened him quite so much as the one fought before the gates of Moscow, a fight in which, by his own account, the French army had done everything required to win, and the Russian army had somehow still earned the right to call itself unconquered. Days later, Napoleon entered Moscow to find the city largely emptied of its people, and soon after, engulfed in flames set by its own retreating defenders rather than left intact for the invader. He waited in the burning, abandoned capital for over a month, hoping in vain for a peace offer that never came, before finally ordering the retreat that would become, in time, one of the most catastrophic in military history. An army, already reduced by half before Borodino, now forced back across the same hundreds of miles of scorched countryside it had marched through only months before, this time with true winter finally closing in behind it. Of the more than 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen that June with such confidence, only a shattered remnant would ever see French soil again. The empire that Napoleon had spent nearly 2 decades building, from a muddy hillside above Toulon to the burning ruins of Moscow, had just absorbed a wound from which it would never fully recover. 2.5 more years of war remained before the story reached its final chapter years that would see old allies fall away. Marshals, who once followed him without question, begin quietly weighing their own futures, and a coalition of nearly every remaining power in Europe close in from every direction at once. But it is in a gently rolling stretch of Belgian farmland, on a single rain-soaked Sunday in June, that the story of the young lion from Toulon would finally, irreversibly, come to its end. Nearly 3 years after the fires of Moscow, Napoleon is no longer emperor. Defeated in 1814, he has spent less than a year in quiet exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba when, in March of 1815, he slips past his guards, lands again on French soil, and begins marching north toward Paris with barely 1,000 loyal soldiers and 4 small cannon at his side. Tonight, we follow him through those final 100 days, all the way to the gently rolling farmland south of Brussels, where his story and an entire age of European warfare will reach its last and most famous ending. The scene that decides everything happens almost before the campaign has properly begun. Outside the town of Grenoble, a battalion of the King's Own Infantry, the 5th Regiment men, who had once marched with Napoleon through Italy years before, is drawn up across the road with orders to stop the returning emperor by force if necessary. Napoleon dismounts, orders his own small escort to turn their muskets barrel down, and walks alone toward the waiting line of soldiers. An officer barks the order to fire. Not a single musket answers. Napoleon opens his coat, bares his chest to the assembled ranks, and calls out to men who had once followed him across half of Europe, "Soldiers of the 5th, do you not know me? If any among you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." A single voice answers first, then 100, then the entire battalion, crying out in one voice for their emperor's return. What followed over the next 3 weeks became, in the retelling, almost a victory parade, rather than a military campaign. Garrison after garrison tearing off their white royalist cockades to join him as he marched north. A popular Parisian newspaper is remembered to have charted his progress in a sequence of headlines that shifted, day by day, from open contempt to trembling awe. first calling him the man-eating monster escaped from his island den. Then the tiger arrived at Gap. Then the devil who had spent the night in Grenoble. Then the tyrant passing through Lyon. Then simply the usurper, 60 kilometers from the capital. And finally, admiringly, His Imperial Majesty entering the Tuileries, surrounded by his devoted people. Whatever the precise truth behind each individual headline, the underlying story was accurate enough. Within 3 weeks, exactly as Napoleon had privately predicted to his own officers before ever setting foot back on French soil, he reached Paris again without firing a single shot in anger. King Louis had already fled the palace and the country the night before. Rebuilding an army from almost nothing, however, proved a far harder task than reclaiming a throne. 10 months of royalist rule had gutted the French military down to barely 100,000 aging, poorly equipped soldiers. And Napoleon threw himself into reconstruction with something like his old fever, recalling veterans, ordering muskets and cannon manufactured at emergency pace, even authorizing secret purchases of firearms from England and Switzerland of all places. By the end of May, he had somehow conjured close to 280,000 regular troops and over 200,000 more in home defense militia, an impressive feat of sheer administrative will, though nowhere near what it had once been at his true peak, and nothing close to what now stood arrayed against him. Nearly every major power in Europe united once more within days of his return, gathering something over 600,000 men on France's borders alone, with Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army and Blücher's Prussian army both already massing in Belgium. Facing that combined weight, Napoleon had only one realistic option: strike first, strike fast, and defeat the two armies in Belgium separately before Austrian and Russian reinforcements further east could even finish mobilizing. His own northern army for this campaign numbered barely 125,000 men, a force noticeably thinner and rawer than the armies of his glory years. Even his beloved Imperial Guard, some 18,000 strong, now included 4,000 recruits who had never seen real combat, and his cavalry, gutted by the losses of 1,813, was manned largely by green troopers with barely 2 years' service, commanded by equally inexperienced junior officers. One French observer of that spring's soldiers described them memorably as impulsive, quick to anger, undisciplined, and prone to sudden panic, yet capable, in a single burst of fury, of extraordinary courage. A weapon, in his words, both remarkably sharp and remarkably brittle at the very same time. The opening moves nonetheless went almost according to plan. At the village of Ligny, on the 16th of June, Napoleon personally commanded 63,000 French troops against Blücher's 83,000 Prussians, and won what would prove to be the very last outright victory of his career, wounding Blücher badly enough that the old field marshal was very nearly captured in the chaos of retreat. It was the same afternoon, at a crossroads village called Quatre Bras, a short distance away, that fortune first began quietly turning against Napoleon. British and Allied cavalry, screening Wellington's own withdrawal after learning of Blücher's defeat, found themselves being run down hard by pursuing French cavalry along the muddy roads until, in the words of one British artillery officer who watched it happen, an enormous black thundercloud that had been hanging ominously over the battlefield all afternoon finally broke apart, directly overhead. In the same instant, French guns opened fire, unleashing a downpour so sudden and so violent that it seemed to have been summoned by the cannon fire itself. The sudden storm turned every road to thick mud within minutes, slowing the pursuing French cavalry to a crawl and letting Wellington's rearguard escape by the barest margin. sprinting through the flooded lanes, with their own cavalry commander shouting for them to ride for their lives before the French cavalry could close the distance. Watching his own pursuit bogged down uselessly in the mud that evening, Napoleon is remembered to have looked up at the setting sun and said, with real bitterness, that he wished he possessed the power of some god, if only enough to delay the enemy's march by 2 more precious hours. Those 2 hours, and several more besides, were lost the following morning instead through simple human failure rather than weather. Marshal Ney, commanding the French left wing, received clear written orders early that day to press Wellington's retreating rearguard hard, yet somehow judged, wrongly, that the British showed no real signs of retreating at all, and calmly allowed his own men to sit down for a leisurely lunch rather than press the advance. By the time Napoleon himself rode over that afternoon to discover Ney's entire wing still sitting motionless in camp, hours of pursuit time that could never be recovered had already slipped away. It was, by more than one account, the same commander who had once famously declared that he might lose a single battle, but would never lose so much as a minute to carelessness. And it was precisely those lost hours and lost minutes, compounding quietly through that one overcast Saturday, that would help decide everything that followed 2 days later. Rather than press the pursuit further that same night, Napoleon made a second consequential decision. Convinced that Blücher's beaten Prussians could not possibly recover in time to matter, he detached Marshal Grouchy with roughly a third of his own army, some 33,000 men, and sent him east to shadow and harass the retreating Prussians, keeping them from ever reaching Wellington again. Grouchy's orders were, by design, somewhat open to interpretation. Locate the Prussians, determine their true line of retreat, and act accordingly. When the sound of heavy cannon fire began rolling in from the direction of Waterloo itself late the following morning, several of Grouchy's own subordinate generals urged him immediately to march toward the guns rather than continue his slower pursuit. One of them, General Girard, arguing bluntly that marching toward the sound of that cannon fire was simply a marshal's plain duty in a moment like this. Grouchy, methodical and literal-minded to a fault, refused, insisting that the emperor would surely have summoned him directly had his presence truly been required at Waterloo, and that plowing his own tired troops back through roads already turned to deep mud by the previous night's storm would, in any case, bring them to the real battle too late to matter regardless. History would judge that refusal harshly, though in fairness to Grouchy, the distances and mud involved meant his troops likely could not have reached the true battlefield in time, no matter which road he had chosen that morning. That decisive battle came on a rain-soaked Sunday, the 18th of June, on a low ridge that Wellington had chosen with characteristic care, deliberately positioning much of his motley, 5-language allied army on the reverse slope of the hill, hidden from French artillery observation until the very last possible moment. Napoleon himself woke that morning supremely confident, telling his own staff over breakfast that he judged their odds of victory at nothing less than 90 in 100. Overnight, rain had turned the fields into heavy mud, and on the advice of his own artillery commanders, Napoleon delayed the start of his attack by several hours, waiting for the ground to firm up enough for his guns and cannonballs to do their proper work, rather than simply burying themselves uselessly in soft earth. It was a delay that cost him something far more valuable than dry ground: time. The one resource that Blücher's approaching Prussian columns, however slowly, were steadily eating away with every passing hour. Much of the day's fighting centered on a single fortified farmhouse called La Haie Sainte, sitting almost directly in front of the British and Allied line. Wellington, in one of the campaign's more costly miscalculations, garrisoned it thinly at first with fewer than 400 men, and its main gate, damaged the night before, had been carelessly burned for firewood by his own soldiers rather than repaired. French assault after French assault ground against its walls through the afternoon, and for a long stretch, disaster seemed to hover just out of reach for the stubborn defenders inside. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the field, a moment of pure impatience unfolded that would be remembered and argued over for generations afterward. Marshal Ney, watching what he believed was a general British withdrawal, launched a massive, unsupported cavalry charge directly against still intact infantry squares, without adequate infantry or artillery support behind it. Wave after wave of French cavalry, drawn increasingly and almost involuntarily into the same doomed assault as more units joined uninvited, broke itself uselessly against squares of British and Allied infantry that never actually broke, the horsemen wheeling and charging again and again as their own numbers dwindled with each failed attempt, squares that, crucially, were now also being torn apart at long range by a new British artillery shell nobody in the French army yet possessed, an exploding, shrapnel-filled round invented barely a decade earlier by a British artillery officer and named simply for its own inventor, capable of scattering deadly fragments across a target still 1,400 yards distant, far beyond the reach of anything French gunners could answer with in kind. La Haye-Sainte finally fell into French hands in the early evening, and for a brief, dangerous moment, the entire Allied center stood nearly undefended, the ground behind the farmhouse open and unguarded. It was, in almost every sense, the single best chance the entire day had offered Napoleon to break Wellington's line completely. But by then, the first Prussian columns under Blücher had already begun arriving on the field in growing numbers, forcing Napoleon to divert increasingly scarce reserves to hold off this new threat on his own flank rather than exploit the opening at La Haye-Sainte, and the moment, once gone, never returned. As dusk approached, with his own Imperial Guard's final assault repulsed and Prussian troops now pressing hard against his exposed flank, the French army began to collapse into full retreat. By nightfall, the battle, the campaign, and in every meaningful sense, the entire age of Napoleonic warfare were over. Napoleon's true greatness lies not only in the brilliance of his most celebrated victories, but in the sheer, restless force of will he poured into every one of them, a force that, even now, leaves behind monuments still standing tall, despite everything time and weather have thrown against them. Monuments that no people living under quiet submission could ever have built. History rarely reserves its highest honors for the cautious or the timid. It reserves them, instead, for those of vast ambition and real accomplishment, for those who, even as catastrophe finally overtakes them, and countless others alongside them, remain able to hold the hearts of millions in their grip. Napoleon was exactly such a figure, a man who reshaped the life of an entire nation, who laid deep and lasting foundations beneath the future of Italy, Switzerland, and the German lands, and who, in the end, turned the gaze of millions toward one small, lonely rock in the South Atlantic, where his own final exile would come to rest. And so tonight, before we let this long story finally settle into rest, let us look back once more across all the ground we have covered together. Toulon left behind an unknown young captain who had learned, in the mud and smoke of a single winter siege, that a bold and clearly reasoned plan could overturn the assumptions of officers twice his age and rank. North Italy, left behind an entirely new way of moving an army to war, stripped of its tents and its slow-moving baggage trains, living instead off the very land it marched through. Mantua left behind a method of war, built not around holding ground, but around seeking out and destroying an enemy's field army wherever it dared to appear, no matter how many times that enemy returned. Austerlitz left behind the ruin of an empire nearly 1,000 years old, and the proof that patience and calculated weakness could lure even the proudest coalition into its own undoing. Jena and Auerstedt together left behind the final collapse of an entire military tradition once thought unbeatable, undone in a single afternoon by soldiers who no longer fought in rigid lines. Eylau left behind a warning, written in blood across the snow, of what a determined enemy willing to trade lives for time could still cost even the finest army in Europe. Borodino left behind the beginning of the end, an army of over 600,000, reduced by more than half before a single decisive shot had truly settled anything. And Waterloo, at the very last, left behind a single rain-soaked field in Belgium, where 22 years of glory, ambition, and sacrifice finally came to rest. Of the 26 men Napoleon had once raised to the rank of Marshal of the Empire, few stood beside him at this final hour. Lannes, Bessières, and Poniatowski had already given their lives to earlier battles long before this last campaign began. Marmont's quiet negotiations with the enemy in the final days of the old empire had cost Napoleon his last hope back in the spring of that earlier year. And men like Marmont, Victor, and Augereau would find their own names struck from Napoleon's own list in return. MacDonald offered every chance to rejoin his old commander, chose instead to stand at the emperor's side to the very end of the old regime, and then quietly step away when it returned. Grouchy, given command at last after 20 years of waiting, spent the deciding day of the campaign faithfully executing an order that led him in exactly the wrong direction, and would carry the weight of that single decision for the rest of his long life. Ney, brave nearly to a fault and utterly unsuited to independent command on this scale, threw away his cavalry in a charge that decided nothing, and would pay for his loyalty to his old emperor with his own life before a firing squad within the year. Some among them, like Oudinot and Gouvion Saint-Cyr, quietly declined to answer Napoleon's final call at all. Others, growing old and weary after decades of campaigning, simply had no fight left in them to give. Each one, in his own way, had already written the final chapter of his own war, long before the guns fell silent above Waterloo that evening. And that is where we leave Napoleon and his empire tonight. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on screen right now. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to leave a like, hit subscribe, or drop a thought in the comments below. Wherever you are tonight, let your shoulders drop a little further. Let your eyes close whenever they are ready, and let this long story carry you the rest of the way into sleep.